Hey, it's Drybear. Back again with more Diablo 4 content, and today is the day that we do a tier list. Today, I'm going to rank all of the 5 launch classes for Diablo 4 in several categories, and rank them against each other for how I think they're going to turn out in endgame, overall, leveling, survivability, build diversity, and how strong I think they're going to be. Tier lists should always be taken with a grain of salt because they are very speculative and there's subjectivity in them regardless of who you are or who's making them. So before we get into the disclaimers, you should come hang out with me on my live stream. I'm live every single day on twitch.tv/Drybear. If you don't come hang out, then the next time you take a hot shower, it's gonna run out of hot a little bit sooner than you wish. All right, let's begin with disclaimers on this. First, this tier list is going to be speculative regardless. There isn't anyone on the planet right now that has all the answers when it comes to Diablo 4 because we've only been able to play to a certain degree of all the tests. Now, that being said, I have played all the tests, I've played all of the classes to the maximum level possible, and I've spent hundreds of hours theory crafting and building and playing the game to really try and see what is the strongest, what is the best. And I think I also have a unique perspective in that I have worked in live games, live online games for PvP balancing. I've also worked on and designed characters and play styles that seemed to work well in development and then changed once we released it to the live player base and they got a hold of it and started messing with it. And I've been doing that, I did that for maybe 6-7 years. And so I had plenty of experience in seeing how the player base would get a hold of something and change it and how strong they could make it or how we think it's strong, but it's actually really weak. So from that perspective, I'm gonna bring that into this as well. I also want to give a disclaimer that the answer for what class you should play will always be the one you enjoy the most or the one that you think is cool. I wish I could just grab people that come to me and say, pick a class for me. I could just Inception put it in their brain that it'll be fine if you just pick the class that you think is cool or neat or awesome or the one that feels the best, because that always wins. I am a serial altaholic. I always torture myself over what class to play, or will just end up playing all of the classes in every single character-based game. Diablo 4 will be no different, but you can play whatever class you want. That being said, I think it's important to have a reference point for people. Some people who haven't had the free time to play the game extensively and study it want to know what are the best classes and what are the categories that they fit into so that I can make an informed decision on what class that I want to play. So that's what we're going to do today. I'll place on screen my categories for where I'm ranking these. We'll rank them on difficulty, survivability, so how tanky they are, difficulty meaning how hard they are to play and pick up and master, their strength while leveling, which is how easy it is for them to level and how effective their leveling builds are relative to each other, how strong they are at endgame or how strong I believe they will be at endgame once we fully unlocked all of the content based on doing tons of Paragon boards, playing them to the max level in the tests, and also making builds for them in general. And lastly, build diversity. I think this is an excellent category because this will not only add to the fun of the class, but also the longevity of you playing it as well. Because if there's a lot of build options, then if you don't find one interesting, you can switch to more. And I think if you have a class that is exciting and has, too many builds for you to get to right away, that is a good indicator that you're going to enjoy the character. So let's get into the tier list. I'll leave the scores on screen for the rest of the video so you can kind of compare them together, but let's start with what I think is the highest in the tier list right now, which is Druid. And I think this is an interesting discussion and exercise in community as well as word of mouth, because historically, Druid started out being one of the least interesting classes for the mass populace, a class that didn't do very well at leveling low level and also didn't have that much damage output in the first open beta, in the closed beta that was playable as well. So many people wrote Druid off as being this weak joke of a class, and they kind of didn't even bother dealing with it. There's even memes going around of how Druid does 17 damage, and that's absolutely it. And then you're probably, if you're in that boat, you're probably wondering why all of a sudden in the last couple weeks, everyone has been touting that Druid is the best or that Druid is actually insane. And it also shot up to the highest level of popularity. And that is because of the categories that we're going to jump into. So let's go through them one by one. Difficulty. I don't think Druid is all that hard to play. I think they have tons of options for playing and playstyle, and you can find one that works for you. But they also have a lot of really nice tankiness, and everything that they have, save for one build. I would say the Sundered Primal is the only build that is difficult to play for Druid. The rest are pretty easy and straightforward, and you have so much variety in how you play that it makes up for itself in any weaknesses when you do play it. Survivability I have at a 5. They are probably, along with Barbarian, one of the strongest overpower and fortified based builds in the entire game. They have tons of survivability, unlike, Necromancer or Sorceress, who do have summons. The summons for Druid provide a wide range of crowd control, survivability, and tankiness, and they also don't cost that much to invest into when you do the companions. So leveling with Druid is super fun, and the survivability tankiness aspect is absolutely out of control, especially if you mix any werebear skills or any of the defensive skills into it. You can very easily access damage reduction, fortify, self-healing, and barriers easily with Druid, and you can scale those even better with the gear that's available for Druid in general. For leveling, I also have Druid at a 5. And this may come as a shock for people that first played Druid in the closed beta, and also we're just kind of writing it off. But once you know how to build the Druid again, they can get companions with very little point investment that can do significant damage both in AoE and in single target, can easily apply any debuff that you need available, and a lot of the abilities that they can work in, either casting or shapeshifting, can scale very well with even just the minor amount of gear. So I would say that the fastest leveling is in the top 2 is going to be Druid. They're just so easy, so casual, so fun to level with, and it doesn't really come with any major downsides, especially even if you're leveling in a solo situation. And lastly, before we get into the final build diversity, is going to be endgame. Again, caveat here is that this is speculative. I have spent a lot of time making full builds all the way through Paragon, using uniques and ancients and legendaries and putting the synergies together. And I can tell you that Druid has some of the best synergies of all the classes in the game. They very easily can mix and match legendaries to get survivability if they need it. They can get damage if they need it. They don't have this crazy amount of investment in a single passive or a single ability that allows them to scale. And I think they're going to be a contender for the top of the leaderboards at the end game once we get there. I could be wrong on that. I'm just saying that based on performance and what they have available, I think they have they definitely have a little bit of a silver spoon when it comes to the toolkit and the gear kit and the passive choices that they have relative to other classes. And the defense and offense combined together just makes them so incredibly strong. And lastly, for the category for Druid, I would say build diversity is also a 5 for me. Not only can you play full caster builds, and there's several to choose from, I would honestly say that the Druid caster builds in variety rival even Necro and even Sorceress in their variety and availability. There's just so many different ways to mix storm magic, lightning magic, earth magic, hybridization of both, getting different kinds of crits by switching between them. You have so many different options for casting, but on top of that, even if you don't like casting, there's plenty of awesome melee builds available, which you don't really get with Necromancer and Sorceress as true casters. You can go for werewolf build. There's 2 or 3 good werewolf builds. You can go for werebear builds. There's 2 or 3 good werebear builds. There's hybrids between the two, so you can even play your Druid as a melee if you wanted to, or as a caster, or swap back and forth. There's tons of really cool ways there. And if you're playing in a group, Druid has some nice offerings for group play and synergy and utility that is mixed in there as well. So I think toolkit-wise, Druid easily takes the first place slot. Next is going to be a controversial pick, but I do believe that I'm right about this one. I think Barbarian is actually in the second place slot, at least for my own subjective tier list. Now, a lot of people have been writing Barbarian off just like Druid, but I think the only major downside for Barbarian is I'm just concerned that there's not going to be much build diversity at endgame. I think bleeds are already shaping up to be incredibly strong, but outside of that, I don't think you have very many viable choices for builds. And maybe I'm wrong. Maybe when there's other uniques in the game that we haven't seen yet, there's new legendaries that they haven't announced yet that really bring the builds together. I think there's definitely some concern that you're gonna have to play 1 or 2 builds for Barbarian if you want to be competitive. That being said, let's go through the categories. Difficulty-wise, I don't think Barbarian's all that difficult to play. They do have some interesting builds that are quite challenging. I think if you went for a Frenzy or attack speed build, managing that and canceling your animations and getting into good attack speed positions without risking your life, I think is quite challenging. There's also going to be some interesting overpower builds, and you can probably even do a leap/earthquake build, which could be pretty challenging depending on how much survivability you're going to have to give up to give you good single target boss damage, which it will probably struggle with. Outside of that, I don't think they're too hard to play. They're definitely harder than a Druid or a Necromancer when it comes to implementation. Some of that just comes from the fact they have to be in melee range at almost all times, and they definitely are a little bit slower depending on how you build them. So that definitely is a downside for them. However, going into survivability, they're not quite as survivable as a Druid, because I would say at base they're probably the same as Druid. They just don't have the companions, the CCs, all of the extra barriers and bonuses and you know, displacement that they have available with things like Boulder. They don't really have all that same kind of availability, but their shouts are incredibly powerful. Do not sleep on how powerful the Barbarian shouts are. And actually, I would say that if you're making a party and you have several friends, try to convince one of them at least to play a Barbarian, because their party-wide presence, their buffs and bonuses are just legendary. It's insanely strong what a Barbarian can bring to a party. So that's pretty cool. Now, next for leveling, I wouldn't say that leveling-wise, Barbarian is on the same playing field as like a Rogue or a Druid, but they're definitely up there. If you build just right, they don't have a crazy amount of leveling builds that are effective, but they do have 1 or 2 that are just bonkers strong. You have a lot of different ways to deal damage. You can do incredible single target, incredible AoE. There isn't major like legendary requirements. As long as you have a good weapon with good base damage on it and decent stats, you can do very, very well leveling. It's a little bit rough in the first 5 to 10 levels, but after that, it's a breeze. So I would say their leveling is pretty good, if not slightly above average. For endgame, remember, I think there's going to be, I think, variety-wise, like build diversity for Barbarian, I think is the worst in the game. I actually have them at a 2 right now for overall build diversity. I don't think they have a lot of interesting builds to choose from, and I think they're going to struggle. But some quick buffs and some quick patches coming out after launch could very easily fix that. Like, you can tweak some numbers, move some things around, and they can very easily be there. I think, you know, you probably will end up doing a bleed build or some variety of that to make it work. However, that being said, after digging into their Paragon boards for many, many hours, their Paragon is very well balanced. It has amazing available options in it that are incredibly strong. They can easily get the defense that they need to be survivable in difficult content without heavily sacrificing survivability, which is awesome. That means a lot for endgame content in ARPGs. If you go full glass cannon, some encounters that have tick damage or AoE or lots of projectiles can very easily kill you and prevent you from killing it. But some of the tanky classes in some ARPGs can sometimes be too tanky and unable to kill anything at any reasonable pace. I don't think Barbarian has that problem. So as much as people would write off Barbarian, I actually think overall Barbarian for me is in second place. The only caveat there is that I think that they probably could use some love in the design department and probably some buffing for their builds that just don't stack up to the other ones that they have available. And if that happens, they could very easily come through. But again, this isn't a how cool is the class and how many builds are available or how well designed is it. This is just a launch tier list for how strong the class is. And I actually put Barbarian just barely in second place. Next up is the Rogue. And similar to Barbarian, I think Rogue is in a very powerful spot. Now, the challenge with Rogue is, I would say, their difficulty is higher. I would say probably even slightly higher than Barbarian. The challenge with Rogue is I think they're easily the squishiest class in the game. Now, the caveat there is that they do have some nice survivability options like concealment. You can get some dodging, you can reposition, you can go stealth. There's ways that you can survive, but if you mismanage those cooldowns and you get caught out, Rogue is probably the most liable to end up dying in general, so it's really hard for them to manage that. But I think if you fully optimize your build for Rogue, their damage output is absolutely bonkers. And the only challenge you have in front of you is how to survive. And there's a question of how survivable are they going to be in true endgame content? Are they going to be able to, still maintain their insane DPS output without sacrificing too much of it to get some survivability so they don't just flat die when they run into some nasty encounters? But overall, I think this class is awesome. They did an amazing job. I loved, Amazon and Assassin in Diablo 2. I loved the Demon Hunter in Diablo 3. And when I saw Rogue, how they were they weren't really doing their normal traditional design for this archetype, I was initially pretty upset and kind of flabbergasted. I was like, what are they doing? This is crazy. But after playing Rogue for a bunch of time and making tons of builds for them, I can tell you that they actually did an amazing job. It's probably one of the best designed classes in the game. They blended together the Amazon playstyle, the Assassin playstyle, and the Demon Death Hunter playstyle all into one, with traps and bombs and triggers and bow attacks and ranged attacks and melee attacks and blades and flying projectiles and all that. I think it's really, really cool. So for difficulty, I would put Rogue at a 3, very close to a 4, but only because of their survivability. I think functionally, it's probably a little bit harder to play Barbarian, but Barbarian is incredibly tanky. So you have that trade-off and you decide how you want to split that up. For survivability, they are the only class right now that I have at a 1. They do not have the insane defense possibilities that some of the casters have to eat attacks and move right through it, and very much dependent on how you position yourself, how you react to encounters, and when you attack, and how you cancel your animations to keep yourself moving, especially how you manage your concealment, your smoke, things like that, your stuns and CCs for targets that can be CC'd. And I think against some bosses, rogues are going to struggle a little bit in solo to stay alive and get that going. But that being said, for leveling, if you use their good leveling builds, I would say they are easily one of the best, if not the best leveler, up there with Druid. If you get some really good twisting blades and spread blades builds, you can very easily, what makes them very good at leveling is that they have abilities that they can use that simultaneously are very good for single target and for AoE. And they have some of the best burst damage for leveling before full builds and passives come online. So if you're wondering how to play Rogue, leveling for them is incredibly easy. You just have to have the right build for it. For endgame, I have them at a 4. I don't think the classes that can't perfectly capitalize on Fortify or Overpower are going to be, top 50 leaderboard contenders. Possible I'm wrong on that, and that non-overpower builds are going to be just fine. But in general, I think their endgame is quite good. Their damage output is quite good. They have great synergies, and they have a decent amount of build variety as well. So endgame I have at a 5 or a 4, because I think they're actually just about almost as good as a Druid or Barbarian. And then for build diversity, I have them at a 4 as well, because I think there are some trap builds that will probably come online late once they're fully complete that are going to be really fun. You have some ranged builds and bow builds that are very good, some blade builds that are very good. There's at least one imbuement build that's going to be really good as well, especially for single target, and it could be one of those Necromancer style builds where they slaughter champions, elites, and bosses, and their mobbing isn't as good, but they can make up for it with ridiculous single target, especially with imbuement. And then there's mixes and hybrids in between that can create a large amount of playstyle variety, experience, and gameplay feel that I think their diversity is actually quite good. And overall, I think they did a great job with designing the class. Next on the list, I have one of my personal favorites throughout Diablo history, the Necromancer. I think this is actually one of the best incarnations of Diablo's Necromancer that they had in a while. I personally didn't like the Diablo 3 Necromancer as much as Diablo 2, just because I think that they probably gave away some of what Necromancer had in its identity to Witch Doctor when Diablo 3 first came out. So you kind of lost some of those options, which is kind of frustrating. But I think that this one is actually a pretty interesting choice, and I think overall is a decent character. There's just some questions around how they're going to perform at endgame. If any of the minion builds are going to be viable for keeping your pets alive, like at certain points, maybe they just die too easily. And then there's just going to be some questions around how all that works. But in general, I think the Necro is super fun, super easy to play, super easy to get into. And with that, I would say difficulty for Necromancer is probably the easiest of all the classes in the game. It doesn't mean that it's not going to be difficult to maximize its effectiveness at endgame once you have a full build and everything working. But I would say that playstyle wise, most of their abilities are very easy and straightforward to wrap your head around. Their minions bridge the gap very easily, especially the golem, which can create a nice little party synergy. It's almost like you're in a party with the minions and the golem that you have going. They have good burst damage that's straightforward and doesn't require a lot of setup other than the corpse explosion, things like that. So I think overall, very easy to get into. Survivability wise, I have them at a 3, which is actually only slightly better than Rogue and Sorceress, and part of that is just because of their minions. I think so here's the challenge that you're going to run into with Necro, at least in my mind, is going to be you want to be able to deal enough damage to clear, right? That's always the ARPG thing, is can you deal enough damage to efficiently, quickly, and effectively clear mobs like dungeons and bosses to keep a good momentum, right? There's a break point for that always in ARPGs where if you don't do enough damage, then you're not going to be able to get through it. There's also a big problem with survivability, and some of that's between what build you play, right? I think that the blood over power builds are probably shaping up to be the strongest for Necromancer, and in some of those you don't need minions at all. And I'm wondering, I would love to make a Skelemancer minion Necro, push it all the way to endgame and see how tanky the minions can get and how that affects your overall damage. And that's always the big question when it comes to summoner style builds is, can your minions do enough damage, and how often will they die, and will that become a problem as you're doing the endgame content? So I think in general, survivability is a 3. Leveling is also a 3. There are some very effective Necromancer builds, but I would say that just completing the campaign, getting to Paragon, and getting to World Tier 3 in difficulty unlock and Nightmare, Necromancer probably is one of the slower ones. I don't think any of them are all that bad at leveling, but I would say that Necromancer is probably, if you're going to play on World Tier 1 just casually, Necromancer is probably the one that I would push you towards playing World Tier 1 the most on, even if you have an optimized leveling build, but it doesn't mean that they're going to be terrible at leveling. I think they're going to be just fine. Endgame wise, I think, again, the blood over power builds are going to be very strong. There's probably 1 or 2 bone builds that are going to be effective. It's just whether or not you can get enough essence generation and whether or not you can position yourself and react to it. And without knowing all of the endgame content we're going to run into, it's hard to make a decision on that, but I would say that they are probably down with Sorceress in being, on paper and through building and theory crafting, one of the weaker classes for endgame viability. But again, a balance patch or a first day patch or even in the first month patch can very easily turn that around. When it comes to build diversity, I think they're definitely one of the better classes in the game by far. They have minion builds, they have burst builds, they have tanky builds, they have thorn builds. Not every class has access to viable thorn builds. Necro and Barbarian are 2 the best. And it's really fun to have that as an option because it plays completely differently than any other playstyle in the entire game. They have very cool, unique builds where you can go into corpse building or blood orb building or blood damage or shadow damage or dot damage or minion damage or mixtures or hybrids. All of their minions have different styles to them and elements. You can sacrifice them, you can keep them, you can mix and match them. There's all these different things. So I think build diversity wise, they are definitely up there as one of the best for variety. And if you're just looking to play the game for fun, I would say Necromancer has some of the highest possibility or capability for fun in the game. And lastly, for launch class tier list, the bottom of my tier list, I have Sorceress. And this one hurts me a lot because my main in Diablo 3 was Sorceress. Li Ming is one of my favorite characters in Diablo. I love, 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 love Sorceress. However, that being said, I think that I have to put her at the bottom of the tier list for launch in efficacy. And let's go through the reasons why I think that. Again, this is my opinion, but let's go through that. I think difficulty-wise, Sorceress is probably going to be the hardest to play effectively at endgame content. Many of her builds require constant repositioning, managing of resources, and through the enchantment system, it can change how you play. And even with some of the lightning builds, your positioning is so incredibly crucial that you have to line things up. You're also very dependent on cooldown. So I think difficulty in playing, just for build-wise, Sorceress, for me, takes the cake over all the other classes, just because when you want to optimize Sorceress to her fullest, or Sorcerer as they're calling them, I think it's definitely the hardest to play in the game. Survivability is only slightly higher than Rogue. I think they're about as squishy as a Rogue, but they do have barriers. They do have a teleport, which is very useful. They don't have some of the stealth options and redirection options, but they do have some mobility and some CC that's accessible. Nowhere near to a level of like a Necro, a Druid, or Barbarian, but definitely slightly better than a Rogue. So I think if you're playing Sorceress to a high level and you haven't played ARPGs before or Diablo before, you probably will die more than some of the other classes, not to dissuade you, but I think there's definitely going to be some challenges there in keeping your Sorceress alive. Leveling wise, they're easily one of the best. They have a Chain Lightning build, they have a Lash build that is incredibly good. There's even this kind of interesting Ice build that I was toying with that could be very, very good for leveling as well, but in general, I think they are a very easy leveler, especially if you're playing on the lower, like World Tier 1 to finish the campaign. You probably will have no time, even though they're a little bit harder to play and they're pretty squishy. I don't think you'll have that much of a difficulty in clearing the game on Sorceress. Some excellent leveling builds out there that really, really work for her. The only challenge you'll run into really is just going to be the extended boss fights, and most that's just making sure that your character doesn't die. You just need to stay alive. But damage output wise, leveling wise, there's some very easy lightning builds that just destroy, just cream through everything on the screen, and they're able to get to endgame quite easily. For endgame, I'm actually quite concerned after having done many of their Paragon boards, many of their builds, all of their legendaries and uniques, putting everything together, the combination of their enchantment system. I'm actually concerned that they're going to be one of the weaker endgame classes, viability-wise. Again, overpower fortify is a big question in everyone's minds. How effective is that going to be? How reliant are we going to be meta-wise on overpower fortify builds? Because they can build tankiness and offense simultaneously, and the damage output from overpower builds is exceptionally high. There are overpower options, but nowhere near to the level of, say, a Barbarian or a Druid in their damage output. There's also going to be some questions on whether you can have enough resource management to keep fire builds alive, the safest of which is probably an Enna's or a firewall movement speed build, but then there's just a question of, can you deal enough damage with that? Lightning is probably going to be one of the highest contenders for endgame, but again, they have survivability issues when it comes with that, and they're also highly positional dependent with Lightning. They have to be in the right place at the right time at all times, and we just don't know without knowing all of the encounters we're going to be thrown at if that's going to be a problem or not for Sorceress. Now, I could be wrong on this. They could end up being, top 3, top 2, or even the best in the game, but everything that I've seen, all the experiences that I've had in the game, and all the builds that I've made, I would put Sorceress endgame as one of the weaker options for all of them and just general efficacy. And lastly, for build diversity, I have them only slightly better than Barbarian. Part of this is because I feel like they lost a lot of the flavor that they had in Diablo 3. I'm desperately going to miss Arcane Magic and Archon form. If you're the same, comment down below, commiserate with me. I loved Archon form so much, one of my favorite additions to the Sorceress/Wizard archetype in Diablo. And I also think Arcane was a nice separation for them as well, to really kind of like fully invest in it. Viability-wise, you're primarily looking at Fire, Ice, and Lightning. And I would also say that the variety in those builds is not going to be as good as some of the other classes. Unfortunately, for some of the super endgame Sorceress builds, you're still going to have very common ability choices in your barrier, teleport, repositioning ability, and damage scaling that you probably, a lot of the builds will end up being quite similar for that reason. Even if you go for like a conjuration build, or you go for some very hard focused ice or fire builds that can be quite different, I think there's still going to be some build diversity lacking in the Sorceress. Again, nowhere near as bad as Barbarian is right now, but I definitely think that that's going to be where it is. So that's my tier list for the launch. Again, this is all my opinion based on just experience and making builds and studying the game. And again, none of this is perfect. When no one knows or has all the answers, all of this could change on its head once we get the launch and a huge bucket of legendaries and uniques and ancestrals get released that no one knew about, that change everything and fill all the gaps, and all of a sudden these characters change their position. But as of right now, this is my opinion and how I would stack the classes up. Let me know how you would, what your choice for this would be down below, and I'd love to hear from you. And of course, you can look at other people's and comment on theirs. just to see where everyone's head is at. If you enjoyed yourself today, leave a like down below. You can support me and my work on Patreon and view Patreon exclusive content, link in the description. Thank you so much for tuning in, and I'll see you in the next one.